The old courtroom air hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from decades of stale anxieties and deferred dreams. Sunlight, filtered and weakened by the grimy windows, cast long, skeletal shadows across the rows of worn oak benches. It was a place where hope came to be weighed, measured, and often found wanting. I've seen it all, you see. I've witnessed the parade of human frailties that have traipsed through these hallowed halls. The tearful pleas, the desperate denials, the hollow victories, and the crushing defeats. Each case a microcosm of a broken world, a single thread pulled from the unraveling fabric of society. That morning, the thread was Kendrick Stokes. Kendrick was a boy, barely a man. 16, maybe? All angles and awkwardness, swallowed up by an ill-fitting button-down shirt that probably belonged to a distant relative. His eyes, though, they held a flicker, a spark of defiance that burned brighter than the dim courtroom lights. They had told him no one would believe him. They always do. The powerful, they rely on the silence of the powerless. They thrive on the fear that keeps the truth buried. But Kendrick wasn't staying silent anymore. He was standing up against a system rigged against him, against the weight of authority, and against the deeply ingrained prejudice that had already painted him guilty before he'd even opened his mouth. The air in the courtroom crackled with the routine. Papers shuffled, pens scratched, whispers buzzed. Judge Marion Dunham, a woman carved from granite and girded by an unshakable sense of justice, presided over the scene. She was known for her unflinching gaze and her intolerance for bullshit, a reputation earned through years of navigating the treacherous currents of the legal system. Beside Kendrick sat Miss Bernice Lowry, his guardian, a woman worn down by life but not broken. Her eyes, etched with worry lines, darted nervously around the room. She had probably advised Kendrick to keep his head down, to let the lawyers handle it. But now, she was holding her breath, her hand clenched tightly on her purse, a silent witness to her young ward's courage. Across the room sat Officer Brent Cowlowell, the man who had arrested Kendrick. He was a study in controlled aggression. Jaw tight, eyes flickering, he projected an aura of unwavering authority. Beside him, Officer Riley Denton, large and imposing, remained impassive, like a silent enforcer. Assistant District Attorney Dana Hollowell, a sharp, ambitious woman with a reputation for playing by the book, sat at the prosecution table. She had probably seen hundreds of cases like this. Just another kid in the system, another statistic in the grim dance of urban decay. And then Kendrick spoke. "The cops beat me." The words, spoken in a voice that trembled slightly but held firm, ripped through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The noise stopped. The pens stopped writing. The murmurs died down. A silence, so complete it was almost deafening, descended upon the room. Judge Dunham, a woman who rarely betrayed emotion, froze. Her gaze locked on Kendrick. She saw something in his face, a raw vulnerability overlaid with an unwavering conviction that bypassed the carefully constructed facades of the legal system. She saw not just a defendant, but a human being. Officer Cowlowell shifted in his seat, a muscle twitching in his jaw. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of anger crossing his face. But he said nothing. He relied on the weight of his badge, the ingrained respect for authority, to silence the boy. The defense attorney, a seasoned professional with silver threading through his hair, leaned forward. He had probably intended to object, to dismiss Kendrick's words as a desperate gambit. But he hesitated. Kendrick wasn't crying. He wasn't stammering. He was looking directly at the judge, his eyes unwavering. Dana Hollowell deliberately placed her pen on the table, the soft click echoing in the silence. For the first time since the case had begun, she was truly paying attention. She saw the faint bruise just beneath Kendrick's collarbone, barely visible beneath the oversized shirt. She saw the way his shoulders tensed, as if he was bracing for a blow. "Kendrick," Judge Dunham said, her voice calm but firm. "Repeat that." Kendrick swallowed, his small hands clenching into fists on the worn wooden table. His knuckles were white, but his voice didn't waver. "The cops beat me. A court officer cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Judge Dunham turned to Dana Hollowell. Miss Hollowell, was this in the reports? Dana Hollowell pursed her lips. She had read Kendrick's file. A standard arrest report, vague on details, nothing out of the ordinary. But now, seeing the boy in the stark light of the courtroom, she saw him differently. She saw the fear, the pain, and the barely concealed anger simmering beneath the surface. There was no mention of excessive force. Your Honor, she said. Judge Dunham turned back to Kendrick. You're saying the arresting officers used force against you? Kendrick nodded, his gaze flicking, just for a second, to Officer Callowell. Callowell shifted again, his expression hardening. I'm saying, Kendrick's voice was quieter now, but just as clear that they didn't want me to talk about it. The tension in the room thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on everyone. The defense attorney finally found his voice. Objection, Your Honor. Overruled, Judge Dunham said immediately, her eyes still on Kendrick. Something told her that this was just the beginning. Kendrick exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly they ached. He knew what came next. The part where the adults would try to twist his words, where they would make him feel crazy, like he was making things up, but he wasn't. He glanced at the judge, her eyes locked on him, waiting. She hadn't dismissed him yet. That was something. He took a breath and went back to the night it happened. It was late, too late for a kid to be out alone. But he wasn't doing anything wrong. He had been at his friend DeAndre's house, just a couple of blocks away, lost in the flickering glow of video games. The kind where time disappears, and when he finally looked up it was late, and the streetlights were buzzing and the sidewalks were empty. He took the shortcut home, a familiar path through the narrow alleyways that webbed the neighborhood. A route that was usually safe, familiar as his own reflection. He barely made it halfway down the alley when the red and blue lights flashed behind him. A cop car slowed to a crawl, then stopped. Kendrick froze. He knew how this looked. A kid walking alone, hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets at the wrong time of night. He knew the assumptions that would be made, the suspicions that would be aroused. Two officers stepped out of the car. One of them was Cal Lowell. The other, Riley Denton, was taller, older, the kind of man who didn't say much, but always had his hand near his belt. Kendrick pulled his hands out of his pockets immediately, fingers spread wide in a gesture of surrender. A desperate attempt to disarm their suspicion. Hey kid, Cal Lowell said, his voice dripping with an insincere casualness. Where you coming from? Kendrick liet. Home. He didn't want to explain. He didn't want to say DeAndre's name. Didn't want to be the reason somebody else's mom got a late-night knock at the door. He had seen it happen to other kids, the ripple effects of a single encounter with the police, the way it could disrupt entire families. Cal Lowell didn't look convinced. What's in your pockets? Nothing. You mind if we check? Kendrick hesitated. He knew his rights, sort of. He knew he could say no, but saying no never really meant no when it came to people like them. It was just an invitation to escalate, a challenge to their authority. Still, he took a step back, a subtle act of defiance. I didn't do anything. Denton sighed, shaking his head. See, I don't like that, he muttered, as if Kendrick had personally offended him. I don't like when they act like that. Kendrick's pulse quickened. Callowell's face darkened. You think we're out here just picking on you? No, Kendrick answered quickly, but it didn't matter. Before he could react, Callowell grabbed his wrist, his grip tight and painful. Panic shot through Kendrick's chest. He twisted instinctively, trying to yank free. But Callowell's grip only tightened. Now you're resisting. I'm not. Then Denton shoved him against the wall. The cold brick scraped against Kendrick's cheek, a rough and unwelcome embrace. A hand pressed hard against the back of his head, forcing his face into the rough surface. He sucked in a breath, his heart pounding. I didn't do anything. Stop resisting. Resisting what? A fist drove into his ribs hard. Pain exploded through his side, a blinding, agonizing flash. Kendrick's knees buckled, the breath leaving his lungs in a single sharp wheeze. They weren't asking him questions anymore. They were teaching him a lesson, showing him his place. The punches weren't wild or uncontrolled. They were calculated, delivered with a practiced precision. Just enough to hurt, not enough to leave marks where it mattered. He squeezed his eyes shut, biting back the pain. He thought of his mother, long gone, and of Miss Lowry, who had taken him in when no one else would. He thought of DeAndre, safe at home, unaware of what was happening to his friend in the dark alleyway. Then, just like that, it was over. Kal-El straightened, adjusting his belt. Denton adjusted his breathing, his face impassive. "You're lucky we're in a good mood tonight," Kal-El muttered. And then the handcuffs clicked around Kendrick's wrists, cold and unforgiving. He wasn't even sure what they were charging him with. Didn't matter. The message had been delivered. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Kendrick knew one thing for sure. Nobody would believe him. He was just another kid, another nameless face in a system that was designed to grind him down. But now, in the courtroom, they had no choice but to listen. Kendrick's voice trailed off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The courtroom still felt like it was holding its breath. He could hear the faint scratching of the stenographer's keys, the distant hum of traffic outside. But inside this room, all eyes were on him. Judge Dunham tapped her fingers against her desk. Lost in thought, she had seen a lot in her years on the bench. Kids who lied to save themselves, kids who told half-truths because they were scared. But Kendrick, he wasn't stammering. He wasn't scrambling for words. He was remembering. Dana Hollowell folded her arms, her gaze shifting between Kendrick and Officer Kal-El. She had worked cases like this before. Reports that didn't match the bruises. Patrol cameras that somehow malfunctioned at the right moment. The way some officers wielded power like a weapon, using fear and intimidation to control the narrative. But that didn't mean she could just believe a kid's word over an officer's. She needed proof. Concrete evidence to overcome the presumption of innocence, the ingrained respect for law enforcement. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tapping of Judge Dunham's fingers. Then Kal-El cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Your Honor," he said, his voice level and controlled. "This is completely untrue." His attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy blue suit, nodded along. "Judge, we can't allow wild accusations like this. If the boy was mistreated, why wasn't it mentioned before today?" The words felt like a slap, a dismissal of Kendrick's pain. But Kendrick stayed still, his gaze fixed on the judge. He knew they'd say that. He knew this was how it worked. The people who did things like this always counted on kids like him to stay quiet, to be intimidated into silence. "You're saying you made this up?" Judge Dunham asked, watching Kal-El closely. "I'm saying there's no record of any excessive force," Kal-El replied smoothly. "And I find it odd that he's only bringing it up now." Kendrick's fingers curled into his sleeves. Of course, there was no record. "You want a reason?" Kendrick spoke up, his voice steady, even though his chest felt tight. "Because they told me no one would believe me." Kal-El's expression barely shifted. "We never said that." But Kendrick didn't even look at him. He looked at the judge. "Before they put me in the car," he said, "they told me I could say whatever I wanted. But in the end, my word wouldn't mean anything against theirs." Kal-El's attorney gave a small, dismissive laugh, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is getting ridiculous. We can't just—" "Did you file a complaint, Kendrick?" Dana Hollowell interrupted, her voice sharp and direct. Kendrick hesitated. "I didn't know how," he admitted. "And even if I did, who was I supposed to tell?" "The cops." The room was silent again. Kal-El's jaw tightened. His hands flexed against his thighs. But he forced himself to stay composed, to maintain the facade of authority. Dana Hollowell exhaled slowly, her eyes shifting toward Judge Dunham. "Your Honor, I request access to all available body cam footage from the night of Kendrick's arrest." Kendrick's stomach clenched. The footage. He didn't know what would be on it. He didn't know if the cameras had been rolling or if they had been accidentally switched off, the way they sometimes were. But he knew that if that footage was missing, it would say more than any testimony ever could. It would be a silent admission of guilt. Judge Dunham nodded once. Motion granted. Kendrick barely breathed. He could feel Kal-El's gaze on him. Unreadable, calculating. Because no matter what that footage showed, or didn't show, this wasn't over. The system protects its own. But Kendrick had just forced them to play a game they never expected to lose. He had disrupted the comfortable narrative, challenged the established order, and forced them to confront the possibility that they were wrong. The request for body cam footage changed everything. Before that moment, Kendrick felt like just another kid being talked over in a courtroom filled with people who had already made up their minds. A pawn in a game he didn't understand. But now they had to listen. They had to acknowledge his existence, his pain, and his truth. Judge Dunham leaned forward, elbows resting on her bench. While we wait on that request, Kendrick, I want you to walk us through exactly what happened. Every detail. Kendrick's mouth felt dry, but he nodded. The night I got arrested, he started, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I was heading home. I wasn't running. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I didn't even see them at first. He paused, taking a deep breath. Cal was watching him, his eyes narrowed. But Kendrick refused to look at him. He wouldn't be intimidated. They pulled up behind me, asked me where I was going, what was in my pockets. I told them nothing. I told them I didn't do anything. His hands clenched together in his lap, his knuckles white. That's when Cal grabbed me. I pulled back, not because I was fighting, but because I was scared. Then the other officer, Denton, shoved me against the wall, told me to stop resisting. He heard the defense attorney exhale sharply, probably getting ready to object. But Judge Dunham lifted a hand, stopping him before he could speak. She wanted to hear Kendrick's story, unfiltered and uninterrupted. Kendrick kept going, his voice gaining strength with each word. I told him I wasn't resisting. I said it over and over. Didn't matter. I felt something hit my ribs, a punch. Not a push, not an accident. A punch hard enough to knock the air out of me. He shifted slightly in his chair, his side still sore from that night. I couldn't breathe. They said I was lucky they were in a good mood. Then they cuffed me, put me in the car, and didn't tell me something. Kendrick finally looked at Cal Lowell, his eyes filled with a quiet defiance. He said I could talk all I wanted, but in the end, people like you always win. Silence. No scribbling from the stenographer, no murmurs from the crowd. Just the weight of Kendrick's words hanging in the air, accusing and undeniable. Judge Dunham studied Cal Lowell, her gaze unwavering. Officer Cal Lowell, did you have your body cam on during this arrest? Cal Lowell exhaled through his nose, his expression blank. Standard procedure is to activate body cams during public interactions. She narrowed her eyes, her voice hardening. That wasn't my question. Callowell's lawyer sat forward, his face flushed. Your Honor, we won't be answering any further questions until we've reviewed the footage ourselves. Of course, because they already knew what that footage would or wouldn't show. They knew whether the truth would be revealed or buried beneath a carefully constructed narrative of justification. Kendrick felt his pulse in his ears, a frantic drumbeat of anxiety and anticipation. This was the moment. He could back down, let them bury the truth like they always did. Or he could keep going, keep pushing, keep fighting for his voice to be heard. He swallowed, forcing his voice to stay steady. If that footage is gone, he said, it's because they don't want you to see it. Callowell's jaw twitched, a brief betrayal of his carefully controlled composure. Dana Hollowell looked at Kendrick, then at the officer, her lips pressing together like she was piecing something together in her head. She had been trained to look for inconsistencies, to analyze the evidence with a cold and objective eye. And she was starting to see them now, cracks in the facade of law enforcement. Judge Dunham tapped a finger against her desk, a slow, deliberate rhythm. We'll review the footage. Her gaze flicked to Kendrick. In the meantime, son, is there anything else you want to say? Kendrick thought about that night. The bricks against his face, the weight of a boot pressing into his back, the way Denton had laughed when he gasped for air. He thought about the humiliation, the fear, and the crushing realization that he was powerless against the weight of authority. He thought about how, when they finally put him in the car, Cal Lowell had been the one to turn off the camera, a casual act of censorship, erasing the truth. He looked the judge dead in the eye, his voice clear and unwavering. No, he said, I think I've said enough. But deep down, Kendrick knew that the truth had just started to come out. The room felt different now, heavier, like the weight of Kendrick's words had settled over everyone, making it impossible to ignore what had just been said. Judge Dunham didn't move for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Kendrick, her mind working, weighing the evidence, and searching for the truth. Then she exhaled and turned to the prosecution. "Miss Hollowell, how long will it take to retrieve the footage?" Dana Hollowell glanced at one of her aides, who quickly tapped into a laptop. After a few seconds, the aide whispered something in her ear. Hollowell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your Honor," she said, shifting in her seat, "according to the department's logs, Officer Callowell's body cam footage from that night is missing." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, a collective gasp of surprise and indignation. Kendrick's stomach twisted, not because he was surprised, but because he already knew this was how it would play out. The system protecting its own. Judge Dunham's expression remained unreadable, a mask of professional detachment. "Missing." Dana Hollowell gave a slow nod. "There's a report that states his camera malfunctioned during the arrest and was later found to be corrupted." Kendrick let out a bitter breath through his nose, a sound that echoed in the sudden silence. The defense attorney, sensing an opening, straightened his tie. "Your Honor, this is exactly why we shouldn't be taking the word of a child at face value. Accusations like these are serious, and without hard evidence, we're relying on speculation." Kendrick had had enough. He was tired of the lies, tired of the denials, tired of being dismissed as a troublemaker, a liar, a nobody. "You don't need a video," he interrupted, his voice louder than before, fueled by a surge of righteous anger. "Just look at me." The defense attorney turned toward him, clearly irritated. "Excuse me." Kendrick pushed up the sleeve of his button-down shirt, exposing his arm to the courtroom. The bruises weren't as dark as they had been that night, but they were still there. Yellowing fingerprints on his wrist, a faint but deep bruise along his forearm where Callowell had grabbed him. Evidence of the violence he had endured. The room went quiet again, the air thick with tension. Judge Dunham's eyes darkened, her gaze shifting between Kendrick and the officers. "Did anyone at the station document these injuries?" Kendrick shook his head, his voice filled with quiet anger. "No one asked. No one cared." Judge Dunham's fingers tapped against her desk again, a slow, deliberate rhythm that spoke of her rising frustration. Dana Hollowell cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I'd like to motion for an immediate internal review of Officer Callowell's conduct, including a forensic analysis of any available dashcam footage or third-party recordings in the area that night." The defense attorney scoffed, his face flushed. "This is turning into a circus. We don't even know if those injuries came from the night of the arrest." Kendrick clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He was tired of this. Tired of watching grown men in suits try to talk around the truth, try to spin it until it was no longer about what happened, but about how well they could deny it. But just when it seemed like the case was about to get buried in technicalities, a voice spoke from the back of the courtroom, clear and unwavering. "I saw what happened." Every head turned, swiveling in unison to locate the source of the voice. A man stood near the entrance, hesitant but firm. Mid-40s, dark skin, tired eyes. He looked at Kendrick, then at the judge, his face etched with a mixture of concern and apprehension. "I was there that night," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I saw the cops stop that boy, and I saw what they did." The courtroom erupted, a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and indignant protests. The defense attorney immediately objected, his voice rising in anger. Callowell stiffened in his seat, his eyes narrowing. Dana Hollowell whipped around, already signaling her team to verify the man's identity, to assess his credibility. But Kendrick, he just stared, because for the first time since this all started, he wasn't alone. Someone else had seen what happened. Someone else was willing to speak the truth, despite the risks. And that changed everything. Kendrick barely breathed, his heart pounding in his chest. The man at the back of the courtroom stood firm, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn-out bomber jacket. He glanced around nervously, probably second-guessing whether he should have spoken up at all, whether he had just made a terrible mistake. Judge Dunham was the first to address him, her voice sharp and commanding. "State your name." He hesitated, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Then, with a quiet determination, he said, "Reggie Samuels." The name meant nothing to Kendrick. But the way Cal Lowell shifted in his chair, the way his eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened, told him everything he needed to know. Cal Lowell recognized him. Dana Hollowell straightened, flipping through her files, searching for any information on the man who had just turned the case on its head. "Mr. Samuels," she said, her voice professional but cautious. "Are you saying you witnessed Kendrick Stokes' arrest?" The defense attorney groaned, rubbing his temples in exasperation. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We can't just take the word of a random bystander." Judge Dunham lifted a hand. "Silencing him. Let him speak." The room stilled again, the murmurs dying down, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation. Reggie cleared his throat, his gaze shifting between Kendrick and the judge. "I didn't think much of it at first. Cops stop kids all the time, right? It's a familiar sight in this neighborhood." His voice tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. "But then I saw how they handled him. They weren't talking to him like a kid. They were talking down to him, like they had already decided he was guilty of something." Kendrick swallowed, his throat dry. "That part wasn't even the worst of it. I saw one of them grab him. The kid barely pulled back, barely moved at all. And the next thing I knew, they had him against the wall." Dana Hollowell stepped closer, her voice softening. "Did you see them strike him, Mr. Samuels?" Reggie hesitated, his gaze shifting to Cal Lowell, his jaw tightening. Then he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, one of them." All eyes turned to Cal Lowell, who sat stiff and unmoving, his face a mask of controlled anger. He didn't flinch, didn't react. But Kendrick saw it. The tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers curled into his pant leg, a subtle betrayal of his carefully maintained composure. Dana Hollowell turned back to Reggie, her voice firm. "And you're willing to testify to this under oath, Mr. Samuels?" Reggie took another deep breath, like he knew that once he said the next words, there was no taking them back. He was stepping into a dangerous game, challenging the established order and risking the wrath of the powerful. "I'll swear on whatever you need me to," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "I can't stand by and let this happen to another kid." The courtroom erupted again, a chaotic mixture of low murmurs, gasps of surprise, and the shifting of bodies. This wasn't just an accusation anymore. This was a case with a witness, with a chance for justice. The defense attorney threw his hands up in the air, his face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. A man off the street suddenly remembers witnessing police misconduct months after the fact. Your Honor, this is getting out of hand. There's no proof this man was even there." "I was there," Reggie snapped, his voice rising in anger. "Just because it took me this long to come forward doesn't mean it didn't happen. I was afraid, okay? I have a family to protect." Judge Dunham's gaze hardened, silencing the room. She turned to Hollowell. "Can we verify Mr. Samuel's presence at the scene that night?" Hollowell's aide was already typing furiously on a laptop, searching for any evidence that would corroborate Reggie's story. After a few beats, she leaned in and whispered something to the prosecutor. Hollowell's face shifted, a flicker of surprise and interest crossing her features. Then she looked at the judge. "Your Honor, according to city surveillance, Mr. Samuel's cell phone was pinged near the scene of the arrest that night." She paused, letting the information sink in. "Additionally," she continued, turning to Cal Lowell, dashcam footage from another patrol vehicle confirms he was there, standing across the street. Kendrick's heart pounded, his breath catching in his throat. This was it. They couldn't ignore this. The evidence was mounting, the truth was emerging, and the walls were closing in on Cal Lowell and Denton. Judge Dunham leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Mr. Samuels, you'll be added to the witness list. We'll reconvene after a full review of all available evidence." She turned to Cal Lowell, her gaze unwavering. "Officer Cal Lowell, you are now under formal investigation, effective immediately." For the first time, Cal Lowell looked nervous, his carefully constructed facade starting to crack. He knew that the truth was catching up, and there was no running from it. The weight in the courtroom had shifted. For so long, Kendrick had felt like a kid trapped in a system that had already made up its mind about him. A system that saw his age, his skin color, and the neighborhood he lived in before it ever saw him as a human being. But now, for the first time, it wasn't just his word against theirs. There was a witness, there was evidence, and there was a chance, however slim, for justice. Judge Dunham tapped a pen against her desk, her expression unreadable. We'll take a recess while the prosecution and defense review the new witness testimony and additional footage. She turned to Kendrick. Mr. Stokes, you may step down. He hesitated, still gripping the wooden table, his knuckles tight. The judge had said his name, like it meant something, like he wasn't just another case number, another statistic in the system. He nodded once and slid back in his chair next to Miss Lowry, his guardian. She squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and relief. Across the room, Officer Callowell sat stiff and unmoving, his hands clasped together. His lawyer leaned in close, whispering something, probably damage control. Kendrick wasn't stupid. Even if the court ruled in his favor, Callowell and Denon wouldn't be thrown in a cell the way he had been. There were layers to this, protections built into the system for people like them. But that didn't mean they could walk away untouched. And that's what Kendrick was holding on to. The hope that they would be held accountable, that their actions would have consequences. The judge signaled for recess, and the courtroom buzzed as people stood, stretching, whispering, waiting. Miss Lowry placed a hand on Kendrick's shoulder, her voice filled with concern. You okay, baby? He wasn't sure how to answer that. So much of his life had been shaped by moments like this, things happening to him, decisions being made about him, and him just existing in the middle of it all, powerless to change anything. But today he had made them listen. He had forced them to acknowledge his existence, his pain, and his truth. He had disrupted the comfortable narrative and challenged the established order. The prosecution and defense gathered near the judge's bench, whispering in low voices, their faces tight with concentration. The court bailiff kept an eye on Callowell, his posture unusually stiff. Then Judge Dunham returned, her face set, and the courtroom fell back into silence as she took her seat. Court is now back in session, she announced, her voice clear and commanding. Dana Hollowell stood, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, after reviewing the new testimony and evidence, the prosecution is officially recommending that the charges against Mr. Stokes be dropped. A murmur spread across the room, a collective sigh of relief. The defense attorney's mouth tightened, but he didn't object. He probably knew there was nothing left to say, that the case had unraveled before his eyes. Judge Dunham turned to Kendrick, her gaze softening slightly. Mr. Stokes, as of now, you're no longer facing charges. Your case is dismissed. Kendrick felt his chest tighten, a wave of relief washing over him. It was over. He was free. But the judge wasn't done. She shifted her attention to Callowell, her voice hardening. Furthermore, due to discrepancies in the arrest report and the now missing body cam footage, I am ordering an independent inquiry into Officers Callowell and Denon's conduct that night. Callowell's jaw tensed, his face flushing with anger. This was more than just bad PR. An internal review meant investigations, hearings, a possible suspension, or even termination. Denton wasn't even here to defend himself, to offer his version of events. And Kendrick knew why. He knew that Denton was just as guilty as Callowell, just as complicit in the violence and the cover-up. Officer Callowell, Judge Dunham said, her voice demanding an answer. Do you have anything to say? Callowell hesitated. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but the officer didn't answer. Because there was nothing left to say. The evidence was overwhelming. The truth had been exposed, and his carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Judge Dunham nodded once, her face impassive. Then court is adjourned. The gavel hit the desk with a sharp, decisive sound, signaling the end of the proceedings. Kendrick sat still, his mind racing, his body trembling with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. As people began standing, as the murmurs grew louder, he finally allowed himself to breathe. He should have felt relief. Maybe he did, but mostly he just felt tired. The weight of the experience had taken its toll, leaving him drained and emotionally exhausted. Miss Lowry squeezed his shoulder, her eyes filled with tears. "Let's go home, baby," she said softly. He stood, glancing once more at Cal Lowell. The officer didn't look at him, his gaze fixed on the floor. He wasn't free yet, not really. Kendrick knew this wasn't the end. There would be investigations, hearings, and maybe even a trial. But he also knew that the system was designed to protect its own. That Cal Lowell and Denton might never face real consequences for their actions. Because for every case like his, there were hundreds more that never made it this far. Cases that were buried under a mountain of paperwork. Cases that were dismissed, as she said, cases where the truth was never uncovered. But today he won, and that meant something. It meant that his voice had been heard, that his pain had been acknowledged, and that the truth, however fragile, had prevailed. Some people go their whole lives without ever being believed, without ever getting the chance to prove the truth. Kendrick got his chance, but how many others don't? How many other kids are silenced by fear and intimidation, their stories never told, their pain never acknowledged? The justice system wasn't built for kids like him. But that doesn't mean they should be silent. It doesn't mean they should give up on the fight for justice. The courtroom emptied slowly, the echoes of the day's events lingering in the air. Kendrick walked out with Miss Lowry, his head held high, his shoulders squared. He had faced the system. He had faced his accusers, and he had survived. He had proven that even the smallest voice can make a difference, that even the most powerless individual can stand up to the might of the system. And that, my friends, is a story worth telling. As Kendrick and Miss Lowry stepped out of the courthouse, the sun seemed brighter, the air cleaner. But the shadows of that courtroom would linger in their lives, a reminder of the battles fought and the scars endured. The aftermath of Kendrick's case rippled through the community, igniting conversations about police accountability, racial profiling, and the systemic biases that plague the justice system. The internal review of officers Cal Lowell and Denton's conduct dragged on for months, filled with bureaucratic hurdles and legal maneuvering. Cal Lowell and Denton were placed on administrative leave, their careers hanging in the balance. Reggie Samuels, the man who had stepped forward to testify, became a local hero, hailed for his courage and his willingness to speak truth to power. But he also faced backlash, receiving threats and intimidation from those who sought to silence him. Dana Hollowell, the assistant district attorney, found herself at a crossroads.